I recently did a video covering the making of a mould of a skull, which I'd made on the channel some years ago, and that was really intended just for a small short project that I was working on. However, as it turned out, the mould was really useful. I found myself using casts of the skull in lots of different projects, so it's proved really useful. But because the mould was really done quite quickly and not really intended for extended use, it has sort of slowly started breaking down. There were some problems with it which I wanted to rectify, so I've decided to make another mould of the skull. So in this video I'm just going to go through what I've done this time round and some of the changes that I've made to make the mould a little bit more durable, and also fix some of the problems that cropped up the first time round. The skull was sculpted in monster clay hard, which made it fairly durable, so it survived the moulding process no problem. It did need a little bit of cleanup just because it had been knocked about a little bit since I've made it. So I've done that cleanup and got it back into decent shape. And what I've done is also to add this piece of pipe in the lower half of the mould. One of the problems I was getting with the previous mould was that I wasn't getting a particularly clean edge where the resin was poured in. So I've decided to include a piece of pipe to make that edge a little bit cleaner. So I'm following the same process as I did with my previous skull mould, but I'm actually using a different type of silicone here. Now the silicone I use is relatively low cost silicone, and that means it's not the greatest of quality perhaps, and I don't mean that to sort of disparage it. It's actually really useful because it's quite cheap, so it's great for doing sort of single or low use moulds, but that does mean that it can degrade quite quickly, so if you're going to be doing lots and lots of casts, it's probably not ideal for that. So I've spent a little bit more money on this silicone here, and I haven't used it that much, but it does seem similar to other silicones I have used in the past which have proved more durable, so hopefully this one will last a little bit longer. So I'm doing the same process I did before. I'm just covering the whole skull in silicone and using an airbrush to blow the silicone into the details of the sculpture. Now one problem I was getting with the previous mould was that it was slowly tearing. Each time I would peel the mould away from the cast, it would add some strain to the silicone, and that was gradually tearing along the point where I'd cut it. Now one suggestion from one of you actually was to add some fabric into the silicone, and that would just stop it tearing beyond that point. So I'm just putting a piece of fabric in here to add a bit of strength basically to where that cut's going to be. So I'm just adding this piece of fabric in, and that's going to add a bit of strength to the silicone so it won't be able to tear past that point. Now another problem that I had with the previous mould is that it was quite thin, and that meant that the point where the two halves of the mould met, there wasn't much to allow them to align. So what I've done is to make these trays which I've poured some silicone into, and that's going to give me some long thin strips of silicone I can use to actually create a join in the mould. So what I'm going to do is add this block onto the back of the silicone mould, and what I'm going to do is once this is all dry I will cut down this section, and because that's a nice thick piece of silicone that will give me much more surface area for the two halves of the mould to align. So you can see how that's going to sit on there. Now something I found with this is because the silicone's quite springy, it kept trying to spring back into its original shape, so I had to have a few bits to hold it in place while this all dried. The reason they're different colours is simply because I've used different catalysts for the two pores. They are the same type of silicone, it's just the catalyst is coloured differently. Right, so there we go, there's my mould which is now fully cured, and as you can see I've also put a thinner strip on the front of the mould as well. I'm not going to be cutting there, but that's just there to allow me to have some greater alignment. So I'm going to put a mould jacket on this, so I've got a cardboard surround around it, and the two halves of the fiberglass jacket that I'm going to create are going to clamp that piece of silicone in place. So having that there just allows things to line up quite nicely. So as with my previous mould, I'm using some fiberglass to create a hard jacket around the silicone mould. I've already done one half here, and what you can see here is I've covered that half in aluminium tape, and that's just going to allow a clean separation between the two halves of the fiberglass mould jacket. So I'm now making the second half, and I'm just using some polyester resin to laminate the glass fibre in place. Right, so that's now dry, so I can now start slowly peeling this apart. Now, a problem that I've had with previous moulds is that I've used Vaseline as a separating agent between the two halves of the fiberglass jacket, and that's always worked well enough, but I have found recently that it has started sticking a little bit. So adding the aluminium tape in here as a separator instead works much better because the fiberglass simply won't stick to it, so there's a nice separation there, and that makes it much easier to separate the two halves of the mould jacket. Right, so there we go. So what I can now do is cut down the back of the mould to free the sculpture. Now, as you can see, because I've got a nice thick piece of silicone there, that's going to allow me to line the two halves up much easier. And as mentioned, I have that fabric in the silicone, so I won't cut past that point. And hopefully each time I use the mould, the fabric will stop the silicone tearing beyond that point. Okay, there we go, not looking too bad, and yep, as you can see, that now lines up quite nicely. And as you can see, putting that back into the fiberglass mould jacket, the channels that I've added to the outside of the silicone sit in the jacket quite nicely. So that should help with alignment, and the two halves of the fiberglass mould jacket will hold that in place. Okay, so I've poured in some rotocasting resin, so let's see how we've done. Okay, that's looking pretty good. We've got some flashing on the back, which is what you'd expect pretty much. One thing that it's worth noting is that because I've put that piece of pipe in the neck, that meant that there's quite a deep channel, so when I've poured my rotocasting resin in, there's much less likelihood of that accidentally coming out of the mould as I rotate it. Something I found on the previous version of the mould was because I didn't have a sort of deep pouring spout like that, I would often find that the resin would slosh over the edge of the mould, and I ended up with quite a lot of it on the floor, as much as I did in the mould. So just having something a little bit deeper there makes things much easier to control when you're rotating the mould. And obviously I'll have to cut that off for the final piece, but yeah, overall I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, so that worked out pretty well. So this one really came from advice from you lot on YouTube. So thanks for all your comments on the previous video. It's always helpful to get advice from people who've done this themselves, and everybody has a slightly different way of working. So it's always interesting and useful to hear how other people do it, because you'll often get little tips and tricks from people that you hadn't really thought of yourself. So thanks very much for everyone's comments. That's it for this one. So I'll see you next time.